welcome you to the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, and I really look forward to it.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for coming out. So what I'm going to do today is give an overview of this book, The Silent Sex, which I authored with Chris Karpowitz, and we titled it The Silent Sex, alluding to Simone de Beauvoir's classic book, The Second Sex. And our point in doing that was to highlight how small group interactions really can significantly reinforce women's subordinate status in society. So our attempt is to make a broad argument about various aspects of interactions in face-to-face settings as being really crucial to the maintenance of a gender hierarchy. But what we also hope to show is that there are chinks in the hierarchy, so it is possible to structure settings such that the gender hierarchy becomes weakened, undermined, and possibly even dismantled, at least in that situation. So I'm going to start with a motivating example. So this was a photo that appeared on the front page of the New York Times shortly after Barack Obama was reelected President of the United States. And the headline was, "Obama's Inner Circle Remade to be All Male." So this is what I think of as version 1 of this photo, because there was such an uproar created when the story came out and this photo highlighted the lack of gender diversity that the Obama White House immediately released this photo. And so literally overnight, waving the magic wand, they increased women's representation from 0 to 38%. And claiming, of course, that these women are part of the inner circle and were part of the inner circle even when this first photo was taken, and this was just an accident. So the idea of using this as a motivating example is, as political scientists, as social scientists broadly, you want to know, does it make any difference at all whether we have no women, 38% women, or much higher percentages of women? And if it makes a difference, what kind of difference does it make, and under what circumstances? And a few more photos, just to pique your interest. You might be wondering, well, of course we've come a long way, haven't we? Don't we already have adequate numbers of women in public office? Well, yes and no. So yes, in the sense that this is a photo of the U.S. Congress that was taken in, there we go, no more photos. I will describe the photo. The photo was taken of the United States Congress in the early 1960s, and only 2% were female at the time. And then I will describe to you the next photo that I would have shown. And what you would have seen is that in the current U.S. Congress, there are 19% female in the House, and women compose 20% in the U.S. Senate. So yes, that's quite a change. It's quite an improvement, much better than 2%. But the next photo that I would show you is a photo of the chairs of the committees in the House. And what you would see, and I'll cycle back when we have power so you can actually visualize, but just imagine I'm showing you the photos of each of the 19 chairs of the committees that actually run the House, the U.S. House, and 18 of the 19 are men, one woman. So this represents a set of questions. One question is, why is it that even when women go from almost 0 to, say, 20%, why is it that their influence lags? We don't have 20% female committee chairs, even though we have 20% bodies in the Congress. So why do we see a lag in the percentages at the levels as we go up in the influence hierarchy? And actually, when I was talking with Mike earlier, we talked about there seems to be a similar situation with Justin Trudeau's cabinet, where lots of publicity about the gender balance in the cabinet. It's now 15 women out of 30 or 31, depending on how you count him. So it seems to be very balanced, but if you look at the actual committees and their composition, the vast majority of the committees are largely minority female. So we've got, and the portfolios are allocated also unequally. Men are much more likely to be holding the powerful portfolios than women are. So we see similar patterns. So one question is, why do women lag in influence even as their percentages start to rise? A second question is, well, how high do the percentages actually have to rise before we start to see equal influence? What's that critical threshold? Is there a way to characterize it? A third is there anything besides women's numbers that can close that gender gap in participation, in influence? So it's very difficult to move those numbers. Is there something we can do in the meantime until we get to whatever the right number is? Is there a rule? Is there a procedure that governs the interaction? And fourth, why does lower influence by women matter for policy? So when you actually increase women's influence, do you see a difference in the policy that the group actually comes out with? And the answers that I'm going to give today are, first of all, women need a critical mass to exercise equal influence with men. That critical mass is not what is commonly believed to be true. So the common belief about critical mass is somewhere around 30 or 40%. That's the target. The UN has set that target. Other bodies have tried for 40%, and you get to 30 or 40%, and people generally think, okay, this is enough. From here, it's all going to work out naturally. We find that's not true. You need a much higher critical mass. In fact, you need a large majority female before you get to equal representation, equal participation, equal influence. So that's answer number one. Number two, women's influence and participation does in fact change policy, but you'll see some caveats to that. So it really matters for what the policy is at the end of the day. Third, all of this really depends on how the discussion is actually conducted. And so even when women's numbers are few, there's a way to structure that discussion with rules and procedures such that women's influence can start to rise relative to men. And fourth, what we find is specifically the adversarial discussion rules, which is a majority rule. If you make a group use majority rule for its decision, that sets an adversarial norm of interaction. That adversarial discussion style actually helps women as long as they are the majority of those present. So majority rule helps women when they are the majority. And by the same token, a consensus discussion style, if you force a group to say, to use a unanimous decision rule, you're going to have consensus discussion styles, and that consensus process is really good for women when women are the gender minority. It doesn't help them when they're the gender majority. So that's the nutshell. These are the kind of the short answers. Okay, so we're back to, I promised you that you'd be able to see the photos. So here is U.S. Congress in the Mad Men era, and here is the U.S. Congress today, 20% female. By the way, just note, we're going from grayscale to color photos, but also we're going from all the guys are wearing black and white, and the women are all wearing very eye-popping colors. And when you do research like this, when you kind of troll online for pictures, you are struck over and over again. Women are wearing really bright colors, and the men are really not. So there's kind of a visual signaling here that's interesting. And here's the one woman who's chairing the a committee in the U.S. Congress. Okay, so these are the answers. Now, I just want to point out that this applies broadly. It's not just about government decision making. It's also about meetings of any kind. If any time people come face to face to talk about matters of common concern, a lot of us are finding ourselves in all too many meetings. As Oscar Wilde said about socialism, it takes up too many evenings. But my point is that meetings are really a backbone of democracy. They're woven into the fabric of our everyday lives as equal citizens. So what transpires as people are interacting with each other here really shapes the character of our entire society, really shapes the meaning of being an equal member of a community. So that's a segue to the three types of representation that our project looks at. So when I say women equal to men, women not equal to men, what are they equal in? Well, one thing that we care about is symbolic representation. And this is just a general notion that there's a signal about whether the group, women here, have equal respect in society. Do they receive equal dignity? Do they have equal social value? And specifically authority, because the problem when a group is subordinate is that there's an association that's not competent to govern, right? Women are considered not as knowledgeable about politics as men. therefore not as able, not as competent to exercise political leadership, to exercise political authority, and especially so over men who are viewed as having more expertise, having more competence. So having equal voices and equal influence for women is a way to signal for the society at large that women do have equal capacity, they do have equal authority, they are just as capable of exercising leadership as men. So it's a matter of symbolic representation. Can the group actually govern? Does it have the capacity? And that trickles down again throughout various areas of society. So it's not just about perceptions about governing, it's also about perceptions of authority in intimate relationships or in the workplace or in educational settings and so on. So that's one thing that's important about equalizing. Another thing that's important is substantive representation. So the idea here is that women, because of their socialization into caregiving roles, are much more likely to prioritize caregiving. They are much more likely to be concerned about the needs of vulnerable populations, the needs of children, the poor, families, the disadvantaged, the disabled, the elderly, and so on. We can get into where that priority comes from. We would argue it's enough to just notice that there's a very deep and cumulative process of socialization into gender roles. This is just to give you a taste. There's lots and lots of literature documenting that we still have vast levels of gender segregation. Just to give you a sense, 76% of education degrees are given to women, 86% of engineering degrees are given to men. If you look at sorry for being parochial, I'm continually using US examples, but I think a lot of this applies broadly. Women are disproportionately likely to be secretary, nurse, teacher, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all caregiving occupations. And by the same token, men are much more likely to be socialized and enter into roles and segments of society, economy, that are about making money, bringing home the bacon, making sure that there's enough financial resources. So this is true in the home as well. Roles are converging, but it's still true that mothers do twice the hours of childcare as fathers. Yes, there's convergence, but there's still gender segregation in what people are actually doing day to day. So that translates into political priorities. If you ask people on a nationally representative survey, what is the nation's most important problem? Women are between 80% and 250% more likely than men to mention the poor, the elderly, disabled, families, and children as the nation's top priorities for government spending and government attention. If you look at activists, most women who are activists are active on issues of education and children. Most, I'm not saying disproportionately, this is most, right? If you were to look at the universe of activists, most women who are activists are active on that issue. That's really stunning. By the same token, most men who are politically very active are active on issues of finances. And that's true even if they are if they have children. So most men, even if they are fathers, get into politics in order to do something about taxes or money. So we've got this vast kind of difference in priorities when it comes to politics. And that means that if we do equalize women's voices, if we equalize women's influence, we're likely to bring a different set of priorities to the table. And that is what substantive representation is about. So why would increasing women's influence matter? First of all, symbolic representation. Women will be viewed as equally influential. They will be viewed as equally efficacious. Second, substantive representation. Because women bring different policy priorities, different emphases, we're likely to get a different set of voices in the mix. The actual policy decision is likely to be different. So now let's go back to this idea of women's numbers and the critical mass. And why would the critical mass make a difference? Why would having more women in the room elevate women's participation in the discussion and increase their influence over the discussion and its outcome? Well, this is where critical mass theory really comes in handy. And this is a theory by Rosabeth Moss Cantor, who in the 1970s came up with this idea that numbers shape a lot of the dynamics between groups. They really shape intergroup relations. And specifically, she said when a group has only a few token members representing it in an organization in any setting, that token, that small group is going to be marginalized. They're going to be stereotyped as incapable. They're going to be aggressed against. They're going to be dismissed. They're going to be erased. They're going to be all those other bad things that happen to subordinate groups. But her argument is this is merely a function of numbers, and that it's symmetrical. It doesn't matter who the group is. The same thing will happen to men when they're a small minority in a group predominantly made up of women. And so we're drawing on that, but what we're saying is no, that's not true. There's going to be an asymmetry. It really depends on your social status. And having lots of members of your own gender around is going to be helpful and matter much more for women than it will for men, because women are entering with a deficit of authority to begin with. And here's where we develop our concept of representation, which we call authoritative representation. So to add that to symbolic representation and substantive representation, we think of this as authoritative representation. It's related to but distinct from symbolic and substantive. It has to do with how people are interacting in that setting. What is the nature of interaction, and does it build the authority of groups that have less coming in so as to equalize authority among individuals, essentially? So our argument is groups with less status in society come into the discussion. They're going to have less authority during the discussion to begin with. People who will have internalized expectations for how much authority should my gender have. Women will walk in with less confidence and less expectations that they can contribute meaningfully, that they have something valuable to add, less than men on average, right? And men will have internalized the expectation that they're supposed to be participating more because they're men. And this is what's going to play out in the interaction between individuals. And we cite a number of studies supporting these contentions, which I'm not going to go into right now, but we wrote quite a bit about them in our book. Okay, so what we expect that women's numbers will raise women's status within the group, thereby giving them more authority in the deliberation, in discussion. And so we're linking the status of a group from outside the group to its status within the group. This is an important kind of theoretical contribution that we're making, that we're arguing that status out there in society translates into status inside the immediate interactive setting, but then what happens in terms of status within the setting can have reverberations back outside to society. So why does it matter whether women and men are equal when they're having these discussions? Because cumulatively, this can really shape what's happening out there in society. Raising status within discussion can raise status outside of discussion as well. So therefore, our prediction that the more women there are in the room, the more that women are going to participate and influence, but there's probably going to be this big threshold that women have to cross. They probably have to get to be a majority of the participants. And there's one more wrinkle, which is that aside from just the sheer numbers, the norms and procedures of discussion within the group are going to matter. And they're going to matter interactively with the numbers. So our expectation is that, again, thinking about how people are interacting is important. So our expectation is that if you have adversarial procedures, you're going to help women when women are advantaged by those adversarial procedures. Actually, let me start with the other one. So unanimous rule. If you have a unanimous decision rule, what you're essentially doing is you're inviting every voice to speak up. Every voice is to be included. Everyone is supposed to be heard from. That creates these norms of inclusive discussion, which, as I said, contrary to Cantor's idea that everything's symmetrical regardless of group status, that's going to help the gender minority identity, right? It's going to help people who are in the gender minority, especially. And conversely, if you have adversarial discussion norms driven by something like a majority decision rule, what you're going to have is women benefiting when they are the identity majority. So a room full of women, the women are the majority, that women will participate more and influence more if the adversarial discussion norm encourages whoever the majority is to really seize the floor, really seize the group, really seize the room. And so our predictions are that the more women are present, the more that women will participate in the discussion, speak up, take the floor, and the more influence they will carry, the more they will articulate their distinctive priorities, which, as we saw, are care priorities. They're not going to speak as much about financial issues. They'll speak more about care issues. They're going to articulate the views that they privately hold instead of, adopt views that they happen to hear around them. And they're going to be perceived as more authoritative, partly through interruption patterns. So what we expect to be seeing is fewer negative interruptions of women, more positive interruptions of women that really reinforce and support what women are saying. And all of these interaction dynamics are, in the end of the day, going to move what the group actually decides. They're going to shape the content of policy. Okay, so again, what we're looking for is the numbers should help women under majority rule, but not so much under unanimous rule. So there's an interaction of women's numbers with the rule. Majority rule will help women when they're the majority. Unanimous rule will help women when they're the minority. So now, before I tell you about the experiment that we ran, one thing I should note is there's a great utility to be had from observational studies and observational data. But a very large problem from observational studies is that it's very difficult to tell what's the actual impact of numbers, what's the actual impact of the procedures that the group is using, because women may be more likely to select into situations that are already very supportive of women, that already talk about women's care issues and so on. And same for men. Maybe men are more likely to select into the finance committee in the first place, where there's going to be a lot of talk of finances. Or they may be more comfortable with competition, so they may select into settings that are more competitive. And then we're not going to be able to tell whether it's the competitiveness per se that's creating what we're interested in, whether it's the numbers that are creating what we're interested in. So we ran a set of lab experiments in 2 different locations in order to really get at what is the causal effect of being surrounded by more women. What is the causal effect of being told that now your group is going to use this procedure versus that procedure? So I'm happy to talk a lot more about that. And I'll show you some data from the real world so that you can be assured that what we're finding here is not just the product of some artificial, bizarre lab experiment. So we invited people to our lab, and we first assessed their attitudes privately, and then we introduced them to principles of income redistribution. You could redistribute income such that you put a maximum cap on how much someone can keep from what they earn. Or you can redistribute income by setting a floor. You don't let people fall below a certain minimum. You have a guaranteed minimum income, right? Or you can have a principle of redistribution where there is no redistribution. Everyone just keeps what they earn. There's no tax that finances support for the poor or anyone else. So we exposed them to several of these principles of redistribution, and then we randomly assigned them to groups based on gender composition, right? So let's say we had 15 people come into the lab that day. We had 5-person groups. We randomly assigned those 15 people to different gender compositions. And then we assigned that group to either majority rule or unanimous rule, right? If they have to use majority rule, they know that at the end of the discussion they're going to take a vote and the majority is going to win. The minority is going to be out of luck. And it turns out that just using that instruction, your group will now use majority rule, that turns the conversation to a more adversarial dynamic. Everyone knows that the minority is going to lose out, and you'll see it turns out when women are the majority, they feel empowered enough that they participate equally with the men. When the women are the minority, all sorts of bad things happen, as I'll show you in a minute. So they either were assigned to use majority rule or they were assigned to use unanimous rule, which basically says you can't leave today. You can't end the study without reaching agreement. Everyone must agree for your group to call it a day. And so unanimous rule then sets in motion much more consensus-oriented processes. Everyone matters. We can't finish, we can't leave, we can't have a policy until every single person agrees. That means we really have to care about each and every person. No one can be marginalized. And as you'll see, that turns out to include women more than majority rule does, but there's going to be a backfire when there's one or two men surrounded by lots of women. Because that one or two, the one basically, significantly elevates his participation. So this is where we're going with this. So they had to have a full and open discussion and choose the most just principle of redistribution, and also set a guaranteed minimum income that would be applied to what they earn in the study, but also they were supposed to discuss it as if it would apply to society at large. So choose the most just principle for society, of course, hypothetically, but to really enhance the stakes here and get them to take it seriously, they would have to live under their own chosen regime in terms of their take-home pay. So they had to set the minimum guaranteed income and choose the principle of redistribution. And after that was done, we assessed their attitudes and we had them perform the task to earn money and then applied the decision the group chose to their actual take-home earnings. So here's our design. We have 6 gender compositions ranging from no women to 5 women. So these are 5-person groups. So 0% women to 100% women. And each one has either a unanimous rule or majority rule. So here's the design. Either unanimous or majority rule, and the number of women is from 0 to 5. And we have a total of 94 groups and 470 individuals. So part of what we're doing with this project is thinking very hard and systematically about how to measure participation, influence, empowerment, representation. And so we went to great lengths to do a lot of detailed counting. So there's a lot of counting going on and lots of details. And one of the detailed things we counted is interruptions. Every single interruption in our transcripts was coded. And we counted negative separately from positive. So we all know what this feels like. Negative interruptions is when you're talking and someone just kind of butts in and says, but have you thought about this? Or you're talking and someone interrupts you and says, I just don't agree with what you're saying. And so we know what that feels like, but what we may not have considered is what is the impact of getting one of those on your subsequent behavior and your perception of your influence and other people's perceptions of your influence, and it turns out all of those are affected. And what we find is that women's status, as indicated by the number of women in the group and by the rule, women's status shapes the negative interruptions women get from men. So we ran this in all combinations, women, women, men, men, women to men, men to women, and the only one that changes in response to women's numbers or the rule is men's negative interruptions of women. And when you think about the Rosabeth-Moss-Cantor framework, this makes perfect sense, because what she says is happening is there's a gender hierarchy here, right? There's a majority-minority hierarchy here. Women are at the bottom when they're few, when they're low status, and there's active enforcement of that status. So what's happening here is in groups where there's just one woman under majority rule, over 70% of the interruptions women get are negative. Every time you get interrupted, almost, you're told that, wait a minute, so-and-so doesn't agree with you, or what about this? You haven't thought about that. What's going to happen to you is you start to doubt yourself and whether you have anything valuable to add. Well, that kind of boundary policing behavior is exactly what Cantor says happens to people in the minority. Remember, she said it happens to men or women equally. This shows it doesn't happen to men or women equally. The only thing that changes is men's targeting of women. And what you also can see is when women are the majority under a majority rule, that behavior virtually disappears. So now only 1 out of every 10 interruptions that women are getting is negative. All the others are positive. So instead of continually being told that, well, you haven't thought about this, and I disagree with that, what you're hearing is, that's a great idea. So again, it's women's status that changes men's behavior towards women from negative to positive interruptions. Here's the other interesting thing here. This is only under majority rule. Under unanimous rule, we see a really different pattern. Under unanimous rule, women's numbers don't change men's behavior to women. The good news about that is there's a protective function of unanimous rule for women in the minority. So they get less negativity here under unanimous rule than they get under majority rule. This is the good news, right? You don't have to change the numbers. If you're stuck with one woman, 20% of the group, you just switch from majority rule to unanimous rule. You've already considerably reduced the negativity that this woman is facing. But the bad news is that if your group is predominantly female, you should really be using adversarial procedures, because otherwise the women in the room are going to be facing a lot of negativity from the one man who's there. He's accelerating his attempt to be assertive, whereas the women are not. So there was a hand here.
Just two quick questions for clarification. Did you look at the other combinations? So proportional interruptions received by men from women.
That's right.
Men from men. So
yes.
That, and the other one is
So this is the only combination that changes with either the number of women or the rule. When we look at the women, women to men, that doesn't change at all.
And the overall levels.
Pardon?
And the overall level in terms of negativity.
And the overall level doesn't change at all either.
No,
Yeah.
but where is the level? So is it higher, lower? Because you have like this baseline of 0.4.
Yeah. So this is actually not a baseline. This is the mean patterns, and what we did was we didn't want to conflate any of this with how much somebody talked, because we're looking at that separately. And we also didn't want to conflate it with just the sheer probability from having a lot of women or not having a lot of women. So we looked at the dyad. We looked at, so let's say all of us are in a group. So every time I interrupt you, that gets counted separately. Every time I interrupt Allison, that's a separate count. And then we average that out.
And did you allow the groups to self-organize in terms of who can lead the discussion?
Yes.
For example? And
Yes, that's
did
right.
that make a difference?
The only thing we told them is what rule to use, majority or unanimous, and we told them they had to talk for at least 5 minutes. Yeah. So that's the interruptions. Now, what about floor time? Floor time is another potential measure of voice, literally a measure of voice. If you never talk, Clarence Thomas, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, almost never talked, has never talked in many, many years on the bench. So he has no ability to influence the discussion because he never opens his mouth. That's an extreme way to illustrate why voice matters. And there are many studies showing that the more you talk in a group setting, the more influential you're perceived to be by other members of that group. And in our study also, the person who talked more in the group was later rated by the members as the most influential member of the group. So talk time really matters. And what you can see here is that as the number of women rises, under majority rule, women's ratio of talk time increases from pretty low levels. Here's 1-to-1. This is if women talk the same as men. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Here we see that when there's just one woman surrounded by a group of 4 men, her ratio is about 60%. So she's talking almost half the rate of what any of the other members are talking. It's a very low ratio, but it goes up. It slightly exceeds a 1-to-1 ratio when women are a large majority of the members. But that's true only under majority rule. Under unanimous rule, we see the opposite pattern, in fact, right? So again, it helps to have a lot of women in the room, but notice that you have to have a lot of women before you get to equality. Even just 3 out of 5 is not enough. 3 out of 5 women doesn't get you very far. It has to be a really visible, large majority before you get to equal participation. And again, notice it's really bad to have unanimous rule. To have a consensus process backfires on women. So one of the lessons here is it's not always good to adopt a consensus process if you care about equal participation, equal inclusion. You have to look at who's in the room and what is their authority deficit out there in society. Okay, so again, when women are few, unanimous rule is better than majority rule. When women are many, majority rule is better than unanimous rule. Third facet of empowerment and representation is talking about the issue agenda. Again, remember, women prioritize care issues much more than men. So the question is, how often is the group talking about these care issues? That's a reflection of women's influence, women's substantive representation. Here's an example of how we coded these transcripts for mentions of care issues. A woman says, well, you just have a little baby, that's one thing. Try getting, a single mom and 2 teenagers or something. Hi, and my fees are almost $1,000 a year to send my kids to school. You know what I mean? It's like, etc. So she's mentioned care issues 3 times, baby, teenagers, and kids. Another woman says, I honestly have no idea. And then a man chimes in, but we're just saying like one child, and let's say he's, 18 or 16 or something, so in high school, 1 kid. By the way, it's very hard to know sometimes what people are really trying to say in these discussions, which is partly why it helps to just code the number of times the topic is mentioned. But I should add that we did do a check coding to see whether these topics are mentioned negatively. So if it's the case that there's a lot of talk about kids, families, people in need, poor people, but the references to poor people are negative, that doesn't count here, okay? The vast majority of the time they were not negative, but we did look for that. So just how much is the issue agenda dominated by kids, babies, and so on? And here's an illustration of when it's not dominated by care issues. So here's a woman actually trying to talk about her brother who has Down syndrome. So here's brother. She's introducing a care agenda into the discussion, her brother with Down syndrome. But the other people are moving away, so no one picks up the thread. And I think a lot of us have been in the room where this happens. We try to introduce a topic, it just doesn't go anywhere. Nobody's picking up on it. Okay, so this is high representation. This is low representation. So what does it look like in these groups? Here we've collapsed. This is the minority female group with 1 or 2 women. This is the majority female group with 3 women or 4 women. And here we have the all-female group, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. So just look here at the groups where there are very few women. You can see again, familiar pattern. Unanimous rule helps. It's much better under unanimous rule than under majority rule. Women do benefit from a consensus process, but only when there are few. When there are many, they're not benefiting from a consensus process. They're much better off with majority rule. So we're constantly seeing this combination. When women are few, it helps to use the consensus process, and it's really bad when the group is using the adversarial majority rule process. When the women are the majority, again, the rule matters, but in reverse. And note again how flat it is. Numbers just don't matter at all when the group is using consensus process. And I'll return to this in the Q&A if you want to. So the final thing I'm going to show you today is the bottom line. What about the actual policy? Substantive representation, at the end of the day, has to add up to, is the law different because women were there? And because not only were they sitting there, but they were actively participating and actively shaping the discussion. And what you can see is that, yes, it does matter, and it's more or less the familiar pattern. The number of women matters. It helps to have more women in the room under majority rule. This is the guaranteed minimum income the group sets. So this is pretty much where it was at the time of the study, about 23,000 allocated to a family. That's the poverty line. But basically that's enough to keep people off the street, barely. Okay? So when you've got 20% female, the group decides what these groups typically decide out there in society. Congress is 20% female. It's setting this poverty line. These groups are 20% female. They're setting a similar poverty line. Very, very minimal floor, very minimal safety net here. Once you increase the number of women to a large majority, what you get is a substantial rise. Here, these groups are about 26,000. So this poor family has just automatically gotten a raise of somewhere like 20%, just by having more female voices that are there and empowered. But again, the story is very different under unanimous rule. It does help to have unanimous rule when women are only 20%. This is a much, much improved version of women's representation. But again, look at what happens when there's lots of women, but the group is using a consensus process. These women are better off with majority rule. With majority rule. Okay, so to sum up, what we have here is a range of measures of empowerment, representation, and so on. We've got participating in terms of just floor time. How much is the person speaking? As I said, in our findings, there's a huge correlation between being the dominant speaker in terms of floor time and being perceived as the most influential person in the room. So that talk really matters. That's one aspect of representation and so on. Building authority by getting friendly interjections as opposed to negative interruptions when you speak. That's a form of authoritative representation. So adding to symbolic representation, adding to substantive representation, that discursive form of representation turns out to be very important. Agenda setting. If you raise an issue, if you are starting to talk about the needs of the poor, kids, and so on, does that actually influence the discussion? Do people take up your thread? Does the group start to talk about your issues? That is also affected here. We also looked at, does the group vote actually change? Is the group more generous to people who have the least? And so we saw that all of these things change. I didn't show you some of our other measures of participation and representation, but we've measured people's perception of who's the most influential member of the group. We also measured their own self-perception afterwards. Was my voice heard? My opinion was influential? These things respond to what's happening in the interaction. So the more that women are talking, and men, the more you talk as an individual, the more you think that your voice was heard and your opinion was influential. And as we saw, how much you talk is intimately wrapped up with how much people are interrupting you negatively. And all of that is shaped by women's relative status in the group, as measured by their numbers and their rule. So again, the bumper sticker version here is, I'll just go to the bumper stickers. Numbers are not enough. So Cantor was wrong in that sense. It's not enough to just have 30 or 40% critical mass of women. Numbers are not enough. Because we saw that even when women are a large majority, they under-influence and under-participate under a consensus process. And we also saw that the 30-40% threshold is really too low. The reality is you need 60 to 80%. And the other part of it is that when you do have just a few women in the room, you can change women's status by changing the procedures and changing the norms. So those are the bumper stickers. And I have a bunch more slides that I would love to show you, but I don't want to monopolize the floor. So feel free to ask me questions, and maybe I'll be able to sneak in here some more stuff about the validation we did with school boards, and I even have something to show you from the U.S. Supreme Court.